I was taking a road trip across the country to visit my family for Christmas. I knew that driving such a long distance in winter wasn't the best idea, but I couldn't find anyone to watch my dog, Frankie, so I had to take him with me. He's just a small dachshund, and I thought he'd be scared of flying, so I chose to drive. The first part of the trip went smoothly. Perfect weather, easy driving, no issues at all. But on the morning of the second leg of the journey, I woke up to heavy snow. I packed up quickly and tried to outrun the storm, but it only seemed to get worse. By the time I reached the halfway point, I realized it was taking too long, and there was no way I'd make it to my destination before dark. I decided to find a motel to stay at instead. The road I was on was nearly empty, with not much around except the occasional gas station every 50 miles or so. So when I saw a sign for a motel, I pulled off the highway and into the parking lot. The building looked very old, with most of the lights off, but there was another car parked outside, so I figured it must be a worker. I left my car running for Frankie and walked through the snow to the entrance. The door wouldn't open. I wiped the fog off the window and pressed my face against it, trying to look inside. It was dark, and the place looked abandoned. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but just as I was thinking about leaving, I heard Frankie barking. I looked back and saw two men walking past my car, heading toward me. The way they walked made it obvious something was off. I tried to walk back to my car and ignore them, but they stepped in front of me. "Hey, is the place open?" one of them asked. I quickly replied, "No, I think it's closed tonight, sorry," and tried to walk around them. "Do you think you could help us? We're having some car trouble. Maybe you could spare some gas." They were desperate to talk to me for some reason. I said no and took a step back, making sure to walk wide around them. Still, they tried to block me. I hurried back to my car as their footsteps crunched behind me. By the time I got inside and locked the doors, they were already at my window. Frankie was whimpering, and I could understand why. This was uncomfortable and unsettling, especially with the road being so empty. One of the men knocked on my window again, asking for help, but it was obvious he didn't actually need anything. It felt like a trap, so I decided to leave before things got worse. I backed up quickly and drove back onto the main road. After thinking about it for a while, I called 911 to report their strange behavior. About 20 minutes later, I got a call from an officer who said the men weren't in the parking lot anymore, and neither was their car. If that doesn't sound suspicious, I don't know what does. Clearly, their car was still working, and they must have left right after I did. What really frightens me is what they might have been planning. If something had happened out there, I might never have been found. In 2015, I worked at a gas station for 2 years, starting in the winter of my first year. Since I worked night shifts, I got familiar with a lot of regular customers. One of them was a trucker who came in often, and his name was Mike. He was a really nice guy, but there was something unusual about him. He was always overly cheerful, too cheerful, especially for the middle of the night. Sometimes it actually creeped me out. One night, Mike came in, but he was acting strangely. When he walked in and greeted me, his expression had changed. He looked around the aisles with a blank stare, almost angry. He picked up an energy drink and came to the counter, and suddenly, his face shifted back to his usual overly happy smile. But there was something off about it. His eyes were full of dread, and his smile seemed fake, almost disturbing. He paid for the drink and left to his truck. I almost forgot about it, but the next day, I saw his truck pull in again. It was snowy and cold outside. Mike came inside with the same expression as before, but this time he didn't smile. He grabbed the first drink he saw on the shelf and came to the counter. As he paid, he started asking about how busy it was and when my shift ended. Before leaving, he asked if I could help him lift something in his truck. I had known him for a while by then, so I agreed, wanting to help. I put on my jacket and followed him outside. The gas station was empty except for his truck, parked on the far side of the lot. Mike led me over to the truck, opened the passenger door, and then walked around to the driver's side to get in. He told me it was right there and gestured for me to climb in. I did and sat down. The truck was one of those big box trucks with a door behind the seats to access the cargo area. I glanced at Mike, and he had that wide, unsettling smile again. "It's just right in there," he said, pointing at the door. I started feeling really uneasy. Something wasn't right. As I sat there, I noticed a strong, disgusting smell coming from behind the door. It made my stomach turn. I looked up at Mike. His face was tight, but he kept that fake, wide grin, just waiting for me to move. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there. I quickly jumped out of the truck, slamming the door behind me, and rushed back to the gas station. Mike didn't follow, but as I hurried back, I thought I heard a frustrated yell coming from him, though the wind muffled it. He pulled out of the lot soon after. I continued working there for another year, but Mike never came back. Not once. I never found out what was in that truck or what was really going on with Mike, but I feel lucky I didn't have to find out. The city lights had long vanished, replaced by a dark stretch of road with the occasional faint glow of a distant farmhouse. My plan was simple: find a quiet place to park, set up camp in the back seat of my car, and get some rest before continuing my journey in the morning. Eventually, I came across a dirt road branching off from the main highway. It seemed to lead into a forest, dense with trees, and far from any signs of life. It looked like the ideal place to stop. I turned onto the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires as I drove deeper into the woods. After a while, my headlights caught a small clearing. It seemed perfect, isolated, peaceful, and completely empty. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and everything fell silent. The only sounds were the ticking of the cooling engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. The air was cool, the kind that sends a shiver down your spine, but it didn't bother me. I set up my sleeping bag in the back seat, cracked the windows a little for fresh air, and laid back, staring up at the roof of the car. Sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, listening to the rustling sounds outside. Every now and then, I heard something shifting in the trees, probably just the wind or a small animal. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to ignore the unease building in my gut. Eventually, I drifted off, but when I woke up, it was pitch black outside. The moon barely cut through the thick trees, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. Something had disturbed my sleep, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it again, a faint sound, like footsteps on gravel. They weren't steady though. They were off, like someone was trying to move quietly but wasn't succeeding. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something similar. But it didn't feel right. The air felt heavier, suffocating almost. I listened harder, but the sound stopped. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I tried to calm myself, but my mind raced. Just when I thought it was over, I heard something else, closer now. A soft scraping against the side of the car, like something or someone was brushing against it. My breath caught in my throat. I froze. The sound moved slowly along the side of the car, deliberate and cautious. The darkness outside was thick, but I could feel it. Something was there, moving around the car. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. I kept hoping whatever it was would go away, but the scraping continued, now moving around to the back of the car. Fear gripped me. Every instinct told me to jump into the driver's seat, start the engine, and get out of there. But I couldn't move. Then the scraping stopped. Silence. My eyes were wide open, staring into the black void outside, listening intently. Suddenly, the back of the car dipped a little, as if something had pressed down on the trunk. I gasped but couldn't make a sound. The car bounced back up as the weight lifted. Silence returned, but now it was terrifying. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I reached for the front seat, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every small sound felt like it echoed through the night. Just as I was about to grab the steering wheel, the car shook again, this time more violently. It felt as though something or someone had jumped onto the roof. Panic surged through me. My shaking hands fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine. The car roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the dirt road and back onto the main highway. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down until I was miles away. My hands were still trembling, and my heart was pounding in my chest as I drove. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me in the darkness. But there was nothing. The road was empty, the trees lining either side dark and still. It wasn't until I had driven far enough and the first light of dawn began to appear that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I still had no idea what I had encountered out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never camp in my car again. Even now, the fear hasn't left me. Every time I think back to that night, I can still hear the scraping sound, feel the weight on the car, and remember how I couldn't move. I'll never know what was out there, but one thing is clear, it wasn't an animal. And whatever it wasn't just passing by. It was watching me, waiting for something. And the thought that keeps me awake at night is that maybe, just maybe, it's still out there waiting for the next person to stop. It was just before Christmas, and school had already let out, but my parents still had to work during the day. I was an only child, which meant I had the entire house to myself and could do whatever I liked while they were gone. This was just another weekday. I think it was a Tuesday, and my parents left for work around 9 a.m. I immediately turned on my computer in my bedroom and started playing games. Oddly enough, just 15 or 20 minutes after they had left, there was a knock at the front door. Since I was young and wasn't used to answering the door on my own, I decided to ignore it. I tried to stay quiet, hoping whoever it was would think no one was home and leave. After a few minutes, I didn't hear any more knocks, so I went back to playing. I ended up gaming for hours, probably 3 or 4 straight, before I decided to take a break and get some breakfast. I went downstairs, grabbed a bowl of cereal, and started heading back up when I noticed the front door was unlocked. That struck me as odd because my parents always locked it, and they usually left through the garage. I walked over and locked it, then went back upstairs to my room. It was probably around 1 or 2 p.m. by then. After I finished eating, I dove back into gaming. I had just started a new match when I felt my desk shake. I didn't hear anything, but I had my headset on, so it was unlikely I would have unless it was really loud. It felt like a vibration, though, something I would usually feel when my parents closed a door or something similar. I took off my headset and listened, trying to figure out what caused it. It was quiet, so I got up, opened the door, and looked down the hallway toward the stairs, still listening for anything. Again, I heard nothing. I thought it could have been the heater kicking on, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had from earlier when I'd found the door unlocked. I walked to the top of the stairs, and as I looked down, I saw a shadow move near the bottom. I froze. Just a moment later, the shadow stopped moving as though the person had seen me. My heart started racing, and I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before the shadow moved again. I could barely make out the sound of footsteps walking toward the back of the house, then the back door opening and closing quietly. Then, everything went silent. I immediately ran to my parents' bedroom and called 911 using the home phone. The police arrived a few minutes later, but things only grew more unsettling. There were no signs of forced entry unless the person had somehow picked the lock on the front door. However, when the police arrived, the door was still locked. which meant the intruder likely got inside during the several hours I was gaming. I also kept thinking back to those knocks I heard right after my parents left. I couldn't figure out what the person had been doing inside for that long, but I was almost certain they had been in the house when I went downstairs to get my cereal. Maybe even watching me from another room, hiding somewhere. We have no idea what their intentions were, but since that day, I've never felt truly safe again. It was the first weekend of February, and I was at home enjoying some time off from work. Everything seemed pretty normal until, sometime around midday on Saturday, I heard something from upstairs. It was a single thud, not particularly loud, but it caught my attention because it was unusual. I'd never heard that sound before, so I decided to go upstairs to see what it might have been. But I didn't find anything, and honestly, I wasn't concerned at all. I didn't really give it another thought for the rest of the day. Hours later, as I was relaxing on the couch and barely staying awake, I heard another thud, very similar to the first one. I looked around but didn't see anything. I even opened the door to the empty spare room and checked, but there was nothing there. Maybe it was just an animal on the roof, or perhaps the house was just making some odd noises. I ended up going to bed not long after. The next morning, I got up as usual and went downstairs to make coffee and breakfast. Something felt a little off though. As I moved around the kitchen, getting breakfast ready, I noticed that the cereal and chips I had stored in the pantry didn't seem to be in the same place I had left them. Of course, I hadn't paid close attention to where I put them before, so I couldn't say for sure, but it just felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but it made me uneasy. Still, I couldn't figure out how it was possible, and after a while, I convinced myself I was probably just imagining things. The rest of the day was fairly uneventful. I spent my time downstairs, watching TV and doing some chores. Just after sunset, though, I heard the same thud again. This time, I stood up, intending to check it out like I had done before. But as I approached the stairs, I heard a faint click. It wasn't loud, but it was definitely a click. I made my way up the stairs, paused to listen, then checked my bedroom. Nothing. So I decided to check the spare room once more. I grabbed the handle, but it stopped halfway. The door was locked from the inside. I felt a sudden wave of panic, and my heart started racing. I took a few steps back from the door, feeling my legs go weak, but I pulled myself together. That's when I heard movement on the other side of the door. I turned and rushed back down the stairs, just as I heard another click followed by the door creaking open. I bolted out the front door and ran to the end of the street, where I called the police. When they arrived and searched the house, they found no one inside. But in the spare room's closet, they discovered grocery bags and a blanket. Someone had been hiding in there for at least 2 days, possibly longer, without me knowing. They were likely coming out at night while I was asleep, using the kitchen to eat and drink. The thought sends chills down my spine. Thankfully, it seems like they left for good after that night. But what they might have done if I had found them earlier is something I never want to imagine. It was New Year's Eve. I wasn't really into parties, but on nights like these, I often found myself going along with my friends. This year, my buddy Mason was hosting a party at his place. He had a big house with a lot of land, so he was kind of known as the wealthy one in our group. Mason picked me up around 10 p.m., and we headed over to the party. There were maybe 20 or 30 people there. Not too crazy, but enough to get me drinking more than I probably should have. We played drinking games and watched the countdown, and it was a decent time. By around 3 a.m., I was ready to leave, but I found Mason passed out in a bed upstairs. Seeing that he and probably everyone else was too drunk to drive, I decided to step outside and grab an Uber. The app said it would be there in about 10 minutes, so I sat down on the curb at the end of the long driveway and waited. Mason's place was pretty secluded, not near any main roads, which made it nice and peaceful. a good spot to unwind after a wild night. I curled up under my jacket and waited for the ride, thinking it would only be a few minutes. It felt like I had just sat down when a car pulled up. I heard the driver call out, "Uber." I jumped up, a little surprised by how quickly time had passed. I must have been more drunk than I thought. I got into the back seat and settled in. The driver looked like he was in his late 40s, with short dark hair and a thick beard. "Big party tonight?" he asked. "Yeah, I guess," I replied, not in the mood for much conversation. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, and something about the way he looked at me gave me an uneasy feeling. At the time, I thought I was just overthinking it, so I tried to relax by leaning back and closing my eyes for the rest of the ride. But barely a minute later, my phone dinged. I opened my eyes and, just as I did, I made eye contact with the driver in the mirror. He was already staring at me. I quickly looked away, feeling awkward, and pulled out my phone. My stomach dropped when I saw a message from the Uber app saying the driver had just arrived at the pickup location. Then I saw a message from the driver asking where I was. I looked up at the rearview mirror again, and the man's eyes were still locked on mine. I put my phone back in my pocket, tried to stay calm, and leaned back again, closing my eyes. Inside, I was panicking, but I kept telling myself to stay cool. 30 seconds later, I felt the car slowing down. When I glanced out the window, I saw we were at an intersection with a red light. As soon as the car stopped, I threw open the door and jumped out. The driver started driving as I was halfway out, causing me to fall onto the pavement. I quickly got to my feet and ran. He sped off after that, and I had no idea where he went. I don't know who that guy was, but it seemed like he was going around on New Year's Eve, picking up drunk people who were waiting for rides. Looking back, there were so many signs I missed, like the fact that we weren't even heading in the direction of my place. I was too out of it to think clearly. Honestly, I shouldn't have gotten in that car without checking where he was taking me first. What could have happened next is something I'll never know. It was a cold evening, and a heavy snowstorm was sweeping through the town. I decided to stay in for the night. The TV was on, playing my favorite comfort show, and I was half asleep on the couch. Suddenly, I heard loud footsteps outside my front door. The sound of boots crunching in the snow was enough to stir me from my drowsiness. I glanced at the door, but no one knocked. Instead, I heard them standing there for a moment before the boots took a few more steps. Then, everything went silent. It sounded like they had stepped off the porch and into the snow. And after that, I couldn't hear a thing. Confused, I got up and looked out the window. The snowstorm had worsened, and the visibility was poor. The entire world outside was nearly white, making it hard to see much farther than a few feet. Through the whiteness, I could barely make out some footprints in the snow near the porch. It struck me as odd that they would just step off the porch like that, especially considering how bad the weather was. I wondered what they were doing out there in such a storm. But without answers, I checked the side and back windows to see if there were any other footprints, in case they had walked around the house. I didn't find anything else. I returned to the couch, feeling a bit uneasy but deciding not to dwell on it. The night went on, and after about an hour, everything settled back into quiet. The soft rumble of the snowstorm and the low volume of the TV helped lull me back to sleep. Eventually, I awoke to find it was very late 3 a.m., according to the TV's timeout screen. The snowstorm still raged outside, but now it seemed louder. It wasn't the muffled sound I had heard earlier. This time, it was sharp and clear. Fully awake now, I sat up. I noticed water spots all over the room, leading straight to the front door, which was wide open. Snow had poured inside, and I could see boot prints in the water trailing through the hallway. The same footprints seemed to lead out of the house, but I couldn't be sure. My heart started to race as I grabbed my phone and locked myself in the bathroom, dialing for help. When the police arrived, they told me the intruder had already left. It seemed that someone had broken in, looked around for something specific, and, finding nothing, had simply walked back out into the blizzard. Either the intruder hadn't noticed me sleeping on the couch, or they had managed to move past me quietly while I remained unaware. The thought of it still sends chills down my spine. Since that night, I haven't slept well. I wake up often, startled by every little sound or creak in the house. I was staying at a small cabin in Vermont, a family-owned lodge, nothing extravagant, just a place my grandparents built and maintained. Every once in a while, someone from the family would head out for a quiet retreat. It was right after the new year, and I planned to stay 3 nights there. The cabin was located deep in the woods on a remote property, and I had to travel there by snowmobile, which was typical for that time of year. When I arrived, I lit the wood stove and settled into the bedroom. Within half an hour, I started to feel the sense of peace I was hoping for. Time seemed to slow down out there, and there was nothing to distract me. I could just relax and enjoy the calm. The rest of the day and night were peaceful. I woke up at dawn the next morning, made breakfast on the wood stove, then bundled up to go outside for more firewood. When I opened the front door, I was surprised to find footprints in the snow, leading up to the cabin. I stepped outside, looking around. The prints led into the woods, but they didn't go toward the road, which was miles away. How could someone have made it this far without a snowmobile? And why would they even be out there? It left me feeling puzzled, especially since the tracks had to have been made during the night. There was no way I would have missed someone arriving in the morning. I grabbed firewood from the shed and brought it inside. I considered leaving but decided against it. If whoever had been out there didn't do anything, it might have just been a mistake. Besides, getting to the cabin was such a hassle that leaving would waste the whole trip. I sat by the fire, keeping watch for the next couple of hours. Nothing happened. As the sun rose higher and the temperature warmed, I threw on my jacket and decided to take a walk in the woods. I figured it was a good chance to follow the trail of footprints. Maybe I'd find another cabin or something, and that would help ease my mind. I followed the tracks for about 20 minutes, but there was nothing, just the same unbroken trail leading deeper into the woods. Then, suddenly, I heard a noise ahead. I stopped, straining to listen. It went quiet, and all I could see were endless trees and snow. I knew for sure I had heard a footstep. Goosebumps ran down my spine as I realized someone had to be hiding ahead of me, maybe just behind one of the trees. They probably noticed me and quickly stepped out of sight. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no reply, not even the faintest sound. The silence grew heavier, and I felt an urgent need to act. I turned and sprinted back to the cabin, my heart pounding. I quickly packed my things, locked up the cabin, and rode the snowmobile back to the main road. I still don't know what happened at that cabin or what might have happened, but I'm certain the person I heard in the woods was the same one who had been by the cabin the previous night. The fact that they were heading back toward the cabin only confirmed that it wasn't an accident. I haven't been back since. This took place quite a few years back, but it's still the most unsettling thing I've ever gone through when it comes to strange stuff like this, and it's something I still can't fully make sense of. It happened during a camping trip I went on with a small group of buddies. While most of them were either off washing up or sitting around near the fire, I figured I'd stretch my legs and take a quick walk through the forest. So I did. As I got close to where the trail began, I suddenly picked up the sound of a woman softly humming from inside some thick brush. What completely freaked me out was that I knew without a doubt I was out there by myself. There wasn't a soul nearby. I could see straight into the area where the humming came from, and I'm absolutely sure it was empty. No people, no music player, no hidden campers. Nothing. but I swear I heard the sound as clearly as if someone was right beside me. I bolted back to camp and told everyone what had happened. Naturally, nobody took me seriously. Even now, I still have no real answer for what that was. But without question, it remains the eeriest moment I've ever lived through. It was the day after Christmas, and I was working the night shift at a small, family-owned grocery store. I wasn't sure why I was scheduled that night, especially since the store had been closed for Christmas and things were probably slow during the day. There wasn't much for me to do in terms of stocking, so I spent the first hour filling what little was left on the shelves. After that, I just wandered around to pass the time. As I walked past the front of the store, I noticed someone standing unusually close to the building, especially for this time of night. He seemed to be walking around aimlessly, but once he saw me looking at him, he didn't move away. Instead, he walked closer to the window and just stared at me. He didn't say anything or try to knock. He just watched me. It made me feel really uneasy, and I didn't know what to do. After a few seconds of him not looking away, I turned and walked away from the window, trying to act like I wasn't bothered, even though I really was. Felt very strange. No one behaves like that. I waited a few minutes before I went back to the front of the store and looked out the window again. He was gone. I sighed with relief and went back to walking around the store, looking for something to do. I was just weaving in and out of aisles, straightening up shelves. About 10 minutes later, as I rounded the corner at the end of one aisle, I froze. Several boxes had fallen off the shelf and were scattered across the floor. These weren't small things that could have tipped over easily. They had to have been knocked down or moved by someone. Just as I was processing this, I heard something coming from down the aisle. A soft, eerie laugh, like a man chuckling quietly, but it sounded strange, almost childlike for an adult. Part of me thought about going to confront him, but then I remembered the man I'd seen by the window. He was big and could have had something hidden in his jacket. I ran to the front of the store and out the door, jumping into my car. I called the police, and they arrived about 10 minutes later. The man was gone by the time they got there. We later reviewed the security footage and saw that he had found a way in through a side door. He had hidden behind the aisles, laughing, and was holding a small knife, some kind of switchblade. The police thought he was probably drunk, and I didn't disagree, but I didn't think that made the situation any less dangerous. If things had gone differently, I could have been seriously hurt that night. Around 2 years ago, my husband and I decided to take our 5 kids to a water theme park in a small town in Idaho. We lived in Oregon at the time, and for the life of me, I can't recall the name of the park. We borrowed my father's trailer and truck, thinking it would be a fun, cost-effective idea to camp at a nearby campground instead of the park's own site. While both my husband and I had passed through Idaho before, it was our first time staying there. To give some context, I occasionally have vivid nightmares where it feels like something is trying to take over me. I often have to recite the Lord's Prayer or call out to Jesus before it stops. I'll admit, sometimes it takes multiple attempts, and I always wake my husband up since I scream in my sleep. I pray for protection daily, wear protective crystals, and ask for guidance from my guardians, especially because I have an interest in the paranormal, so I believe taking precautions is wise. The first night at the campground went smoothly, nothing unusual. The next day, we spent the whole day at the park, had a great time, and returned to cook dinner and get the kids ready for bed. I should also mention that while I've read a lot about sleep paralysis, I had never experienced it before this night, and I haven't since. Once we were all settled in bed, I started to drift off. But then, suddenly, it felt like I was both asleep and awake at the same time. The trailer around me was blurry, and I couldn't move or scream, but I was fully aware. My eyes moved to the end of the bed, where I saw what appeared to be a small, terrifying figure, about 4 feet tall. In my mind, It felt like a creature with horns, though its face was unclear, yet frightening. The sense of dread was overwhelming. Then, my husband grabbed my arm, and I jolted awake. He asked if I was okay since I had been screaming. I told him I was fine and tried to go back to sleep, but the same thing happened again. This time, the figure was even closer. In my head, I repeated, "Jesus is my savior, leave me alone." But it wouldn't go away. I tried to scream for my husband, but no sound came out. Again, my husband woke me, and I reassured him that I was okay. I tried to rest once more, but the creature appeared again, even nearer than before. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it off, and my husband kept waking me. This time, I told him what was happening. He apologized for not noticing sooner and, concerned, urged me to stay awake. I didn't try to sleep again. Instead, I held on to him as tightly as I could, feeling like something was trying to drag me back into sleep. I fought it as hard as I could, knowing he was my only safety. The next morning, I told him everything, still in disbelief about what had happened. I never looked into the area, nor do I remember the name of the campground. I've kept this story to myself for a long time, but I wanted to share it now. I have no idea what I experienced that night, but I hope it's something I never have to go through again. My best friend, Lisa, and I have a unique way of communicating. We whistle back and forth. We've been friends for years, and this has become a little habit we picked up. Whenever we need to find each other or catch each other's attention, one of us will whistle a simple high-pitched note followed by a lower one. We decided to go camping in off-season conditions in a remote area in Arizona. We didn't expect the weather to be so cold, and we were shocked to find that we were one of only 3 groups camping in the mountains. One evening, the campers next to us warned us that we could get up to 5 inches of snow overnight, so I decided to gather as much firewood as I could before the sun set. I collected all the wood around our campsite by the lake, but I still felt it wasn't enough, so I decided to take Lisa's SUV and head further into the woods. As soon as I left the campsite, the atmosphere felt strange. There's just something unsettling about being alone in the woods, like you're being watched, even when you're not. But I've been through it before, and I had my handgun with me, so I pushed through the unease and kept searching for more firewood. I spent about an hour driving and walking, collecting a few more bundles. When I drove slowly past a clearing and spotted a fresh, overturned log, it looked perfect. I couldn't pass it up, so I parked the SUV and headed out on foot. I got about halfway to the log when I heard it, a 2-tone whistle. One high note followed by a low one, coming from somewhere close by. At first, I thought it was Lisa, maybe just messing with me, but then I realized I hadn't seen her for a while. I stopped dead in my tracks and spun around, scanning the area. But sure enough, I was completely alone. My heart started racing, and I made a dash for that log, grabbed it, and sprinted back to the SUV. I got back to camp and found Lisa by the fire, completely relaxed. I still don't know what to make of what happened, but it absolutely terrified me. My friend's grandfather owns a cabin property up a canyon in a remote part of southern Wyoming. A fire swept through the area a few years ago, destroying the cabin. Now, all that's left is a field of burned trees, with young quaking aspen saplings growing back. Last summer, my friend and I decided to camp there because it's very secluded, and the land is private. To get to it, you have to drive through a road that's blocked off by a locked gate, and the area is overrun with thick vegetation. Getting there was a real challenge, so I want to emphasize that we were absolutely alone. This isn't a place that anyone could just stumble upon. You would have to know exactly where it is, how to reach it, and then push through the rough terrain. We finally found a spot to set up camp just above where his cabin used to be, on the gravel roundabout road that used to circle the cabin. That night, As we were getting settled in, we heard something outside our tent. It wasn't a small animal or any kind of four-legged creature. It sounded like the steady rhythm of heavy boots walking. Anyone who's walked on gravel can tell the difference between the sound of 2 feet walking and 4. The footsteps circled around the tent for a while and then disappeared. Needless to say, we spent the night with our rifles nearby. I'm not sure how much it matters, but the property is about 30 miles south of the well-known Skinwalker Ranch, if you measure in a straight line. We haven't been back since that trip. I live in Ohio, and recently my folks have gotten really into camping. They've stayed at different parks across the state, but their favorite has been Birch Hollow State Park. They've been inviting me to join them for ages, and I finally gave in and agreed to tag along one weekend. That day, I went out and bought a small tent for myself and a sleeping bag. I was actually looking forward to giving camping a shot. I stopped to grab graham crackers, chocolate, and marshmallows so I could make some s'mores, of course. Eventually, I hit the road toward Birch Hollow and was in high spirits. I had my playlist going in the car and was generally feeling good. I got off the interstate and turned onto a rural road that led toward the park. All of a sudden, without any warning, my mood flipped completely. Instead of feeling excited and upbeat, I suddenly felt incredibly low. This sort of emotional shift doesn't usually happen to me. I've never been diagnosed with any kind of mental health issues, no mood swings or anything like that. But right then, I felt like bursting into tears. It's hard to explain exactly what it felt like, but the whole atmosphere around me seemed to change. The colors of the landscape looked dull and off. I had this heavy sadness hanging over me like a fog. All I wanted to do was turn around, drive home, and curl up in my bed and cry. The rest of the weekend at the campground went fine, nothing unusual, but that strange moment on the drive-in really stuck with me. It was like driving through some invisible wall of sadness, and it shook me so much I didn't want to go back there again. Just the other day, I was talking with my mom while she was browsing for new places to camp this coming weekend. She mentioned Birch Hollow and asked if I'd be up for joining again. I told her no. I explained what had happened to me the last time we went there. I'd already shared the story with my brother and a couple of friends when they asked about how my first camping trip went. I told her the same version I'd told them. When I finished telling her everything, she didn't say anything right away. She just sat there quiet for a while. Then she finally said the exact same thing happened to her on that drive-in. She told me that every time she and my dad take that route, they'll be laughing or singing in the car, but the second they get off the freeway, she feels this wave of sadness and wants to cry. Sometimes they even start arguing out of nowhere. She said she goes from feeling fine and cheerful to suddenly overwhelmed with the need to cry. And she told me this happens to her every single time they go. She's always come up with reasons for it. Stress, tiredness, whatever. And since the feeling fades once they arrive, she never thought much of it. She even admitted she didn't want to tell me that it happens to her too, because it felt too strange to believe. I usually consider myself pretty grounded when it comes to stuff like this, ghosts, energy, whatever. I've never really bought into that, but this experience made me wonder if certain places really can hold onto something dark. I ended up looking it up online. I searched for anything bad that might have happened in that part of Ohio. The first result that popped up was about the Bear Creek killings in early 1825, where a group of settlers murdered several native people, 2 adult men, 3 women, and 4 children. Guess where it happened? Right near the road you take when you get off the highway toward Birch Hollow. Even though I'm still not sure what I believe, I can't ignore how that moment made me feel. I think it's possible that the pain from things that happened in the past can still linger in places like that, where something terrible occurred, like that massacre. It was the day before Christmas Eve, and I had just hopped into my car to complete a few delivery orders. With the holiday season in full swing, I was hoping it would bring in better tips. Around 11 p.m., I received an order. It seemed pretty standard, a bag of food to deliver to someone's house. Most of my previous deliveries had been groceries, likely because stores were closing for the next couple of days. But this one was different. The address was farther away than I would normally go, but with so few other orders coming in, I decided to take it. The snow was falling lightly outside, and the streets were empty, making the drive peaceful. However, when I reached the location, I realized this wasn't your typical neighborhood. What I thought was the entrance to a subdivision turned out to be just a narrow path through the trees, leading to a small cabin-like house at the end. I slowly pulled in and parked, then grabbed the food and headed to the door. As I knocked, I could hear the sounds of people chatting and laughing inside. It sounded like a group of people, but I couldn't figure out how they'd all fit in such a small house. There was also something strange about the way the voices sounded, like they weren't quite right. It was unsettling. The door opened, and a man appeared. His presence caught me off guard because it wasn't what I was expecting. The house was still, with no one running around, and most of the lights were off. Yet, the sounds of a large holiday gathering came from deep inside the cabin. The man smiled at me and said, "Why don't you bring the food in? They'll be happy to see you." I hesitated, feeling uneasy. I was about to refuse and come up with an excuse, but before I could, he continued, "They just want to thank you for working during the holidays. You'll be glad you came by." His words were odd and a little creepy. Meanwhile, the chatter from inside continued, but then, just like that, it stopped. The cabin went completely silent, as though a recording had been turned off. The man turned, clearly surprised by the sudden quiet. But before he could do anything else, I dropped the bag of food on the porch and ran back to my car. I didn't stop driving until I was far away, and I didn't do any more deliveries that night. I just stayed home for the rest of the holiday. Nothing really happened at that cabin, but the whole thing felt so strange, and the thoughts of what might have happened still bother me. Back when I was in the 6th grade, I lived in a quiet little town in southern Minnesota. Just beyond the edge of town, there was a small patch of woods. My buddies and I all lived in a mobile home community that sat right up against those trees. One evening, we thought it would be fun to head into the woods and fool around a bit. We ended up staying in there for close to 4 hours before something strange happened. We had made our way deep into the heart of the forest and were just hanging out, not thinking about anything serious. At that point, we were all just standing around talking. Then, I heard something behind me, footsteps, and the crunching of leaves underfoot. I turned to see where the sound was coming from and saw a person, shaped shadow standing still and staring in my direction. My friends noticed I was distracted and asked what I was looking at, but they couldn't see what I was seeing. I told them someone was out there. That's when I got the feeling that this thing didn't want to be noticed. Maybe that's why I was the only one who saw it. When it realized I had spotted it, the figure quickly turned and ran off. My friends didn't see it, but they did hear the sound of feet hurrying away through the woods. Even though they couldn't see the figure, they definitely caught the sound of someone or something leaving the area fast. We all agreed it would be best to slowly and quietly make our way out of the woods, just in case there was anything else out there that might pose a risk. But that didn't protect us from what came next. From the direction the thing had run toward, we suddenly heard a sound that shook all of us. It was a high-pitched, screaming kind of noise, like someone dragging their hand up and down piano strings, but with a rough, metallic edge to it. It sounded rusty and broken, and it chilled us to the bone. That was enough. We took off running and didn't stop until each of us had reached our own trailers. None of us paused to say a word, we just kept sprinting. After that night, we never brought it up again. Not once. I still don't know exactly what happened out there. I've looked into similar stories since then, and one possibility that comes up is something called a banshee, but I can't say for sure. This happened to my boyfriend and me about 2 years back. We were both around 30 at the time. Even now, thinking about it gives me goosebumps and makes my chest tighten. We went camping for the night in the Sierra National Forest, not far from Shaver Lake, California. We weren't too far off the main highway, maybe 15 minutes, but still way out there. All that was around us were dirt service roads and trees for miles. We got there early in the afternoon and found a great open spot near the top of a small hill just off the road. We unpacked, set up our tent, and made ourselves comfortable. We had a few beers while cooking dinner and only saw about 4 vehicles pass through between the time we arrived and when the sun dipped. All of them looked like hunters heading out. By the time it hit 7 p.m., it was almost fully dark. It was quiet and peaceful, and although that should have felt nice, there was something a bit unsettling about how empty the woods felt. I've been camping a bunch, probably over 40 times, but it's almost always been with a bigger group or at a campground. After dinner, once it was dark, we tied our food up in a bare bag and smoked a little before laying out on a blanket to watch the stars. I started feeling relaxed and even forgot for a bit that we were completely alone out there. Later, we climbed into the tent and just sat talking for at least an hour. I'm pretty tall, but our little 2-person tent still has enough headroom that I can sit up comfortably. The rain cover was just draped over the tent loosely. It wasn't clipped in or staked down. It covered one whole side while the other half was left mostly open. We could see through the mesh screen and into the trees in front of us, which were dimly lit by the moon. That's when things started to get weird. I'd been browsing a lot of creepy stuff online and decided to tell my boyfriend about the subreddit called r/3kings. It's all about this spooky thing where you set up 2 mirrors and a candle in a dark room at exactly 3 a.m. And supposedly, because of a mix of being tired and something beyond us, you see faces in the mirrors that talk to you. I was just trying to mess with him, but honestly, I was giving myself the creeps too. The woods were totally silent. Not even the tiniest breeze. Not a single rustle. The air was dead still. If there had been any wind at all, we would have noticed. Right when I paused the story, the rainfly started to pull back slowly. Not falling. Not blown by wind. No joke. It looked like someone was very slowly sliding it off from the other side. I'll never forget the noise it made as it moved. We turned toward each other wide-eyed, completely still. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. The fly kept moving, inch by inch, until it finally slipped all the way off the tent. Behind us was pitch black. We couldn't see much at all, but my brain was already imagining every horror creature I've ever seen in a movie. I'd like to say I jumped into action and protected us, but the truth is, I was paralyzed with fear, totally frozen. It's a terrifying feeling. We sat there, silent and not moving, for maybe 10 seconds before I finally reached over, grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out behind us. Nothing, not a thing. We both let out a huge breath at the same time and started whispering like crazy, trying to make sense of it. I stepped out of the tent and did a full circle around the clearing with the flashlight. Didn't see anything. After a while, I felt kind of dumb, so we went back to bed and somehow managed to fall asleep. The next morning, we woke up early and started breaking down camp. It was sunny and still, and even though it felt good being out there in the daylight, I couldn't shake the weird tension from the night before. I was kneeling down, rolling up the tent, and kept glancing around the forest without meaning to. My boyfriend was over by the table, putting together some food, maybe 25 to 30 feet away. Still, there was no one around. No birds calling, no squirrels, nothing moving. Then I heard 2 sharp thumps, fast and clear, coming from right behind me. They were maybe 2 seconds apart and sounded kind of like an axe hitting a log, but not quite as sharp. A little duller. They were close, maybe 100 feet or less. As soon as I turned my head, my boyfriend stood up straight, like he heard it too. I spun around, but again, there was nothing there. We both kind of looked at each other and said, "Yeah, we're leaving." We packed up fast and got out of there. My heart was still racing until we were back on the main road, heading toward town. I don't think I've ever been that creeped out for so long before in my life. If anyone reading this has a guess about what might have happened that night, I'd love to hear it. Every year, towards the end of February, my close friend Eli and I make it a point to go on a camping trip together. We've done plenty of backpacking and camping trips before, but there was something uniquely peaceful about camping in a snow-covered forest, especially when we had the proper equipment. It didn't feel as dangerous as some might think. This particular year, we arrived at our usual spot, set up our tents, built a fire, and cracked open a few drinks, enjoying the warmth of the flames. Not long after settling in, we heard something chilling. It was a scream, deep and unsettling, that echoed across the snowy woods. The sound only lasted a few moments, then everything fell silent again. Both of us jumped up from our seats, startled by the noise. It came from too far away for us to see who or what it was, but we both instinctively glanced in that direction. Eli immediately suggested it was probably just an animal making a strange noise, since there was no way someone else could be out here. I wasn't so sure and thought it might actually be a person, but neither of us knew what to make of it. All we could do was wait and see if we heard it again. The silence stretched on for a while, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky. As the temperature dropped, we added more wood to the fire and started cooking. But just as we were beginning to settle back into the evening, that scream returned. This time, it was closer, maybe only 200 feet away from where we were camped. Eli and I exchanged a look, both realizing we should check it out before it got completely dark. I grabbed my knife, just in case, and we bundled up to head into the woods. We moved carefully, unsure of what we might find, and had only gone about 150 feet when we heard the scream again. This time, it seemed to come from right next to us. I froze and stared into the dark, but there was nothing there. I glanced over at Eli, who looked just as concerned as I felt. We stood there motionless for nearly 5 minutes before Eli began to move forward again, albeit slowly. He passed a few trees before stopping abruptly. I could sense the fear in his posture. I moved closer and nearly gagged at the sight. A deer carcass lay in the snow, clearly recently killed. Then, I felt Eli's hand tap me on the shoulder. I looked up, and across the woods, standing there like a figure carved out of the night, was a man. He stood still, wearing very little for winter, just watching us with an unsettling gaze. Felt like he was studying us. Eli tapped my shoulder again, harder this time, and I knew exactly what he meant. We didn't need to say a word as we turned and hurried back to our camp. We rushed through packing up our things and left without hesitation, not once speaking as we made our way out of the area. To this day, I don't have an explanation for what we saw that night, or who that person was, or whether it was the same person who had screamed. But after that, Eli and I decided to avoid our usual camping spot and find a new place, hoping we'd never encounter anything like that again. This happened sometime in either 2011 or 2012. I can't say for sure which year. My 2 sisters, my dad, my stepmom, and I went on a camping trip. I don't remember the exact location, but it was somewhere in the UK, near a farm field in a quiet little village. My sisters, Emma and Chloe, and I were outside just goofing off, running around, doing the usual stuff kids do. Suddenly, Chloe looked up and said, "What is that?" while pointing toward the sky. Floating about 15 or maybe 20 feet above the ground was this dark balloon-like shape. It was moving in an oddly perfect straight line, completely steady, no curves, no dipping or rising. It didn't seem to react to the breeze at all, kept the same speed the entire time and didn't wobble one bit. It looked about the same size as a regular birthday balloon, but it was entirely black. There was some kind of string hanging from it, but even that wasn't moving in the wind. At first, we figured it must have just been a random balloon that drifted away. But we quickly realized that didn't make sense. Balloons don't move like that. They bob around, get pushed by gusts of wind, float up and down. But this didn't do any of that. It just went forward, smooth and straight. It gave me this awful feeling, like something was really wrong. I actually felt queasy watching it. A couple of days later, when we got back home, I told my older brother, Matthew, about it. He hadn't come with us on that trip. He said maybe it was some kind of drone or something like that, but it didn't make any sound at all, and there were no visible parts like rotors or anything else that drones usually have. I'm still not sure what we saw that day. I don't know if it was some weird spirit thing, a machine from somewhere else, or what, but if anyone has a clue what it could have been, I'd really like to hear it. Something happened on a camping trip nearly 2 decades ago, and it still sticks with me to this day. I had gone to visit my aunt and my cousin Emily in a remote part of West Virginia. I was around 17 years old, and Emily was about 13 at the time. One afternoon, Emily asked if we could go camp outside. Her idea of camping was setting up a tent on top of this big hill on their property. The hill was sharply sloped, and thick trees covered the top. I had never been camping before that, but I figured if anything went wrong, we could just head back downhill to the house. So I told her sure, why not? We pitched the tent close to the edge of the woods, with the entrance facing out toward the view of the valley below. We roasted marshmallows, shared a few spooky stories by the fire, and got inside the tent sometime around midnight. Emily dozed off quickly, but I couldn't fall asleep, so I just laid there trying to relax. Not long after, I heard the sound of dry leaves being moved behind the tent, up in the woods. I also heard something walking out of the trees. It would take a few slow steps, then pause, then a few more, then stop again. As the sound drew closer, I could hear whatever it was stepping onto some big rocks. The noise it made was heavy and had a deep, solid clomp, almost like how a horse sounds when it steps onto stone. When it got close to the tent, I could actually feel the ground thudding slightly under me with each step it took. That told me the thing was really big and heavy. At first, I assumed it was a large deer or elk. I thought about waking Emily up so she could see it too, but then it kept getting closer, closer than any wild animal usually would. And that's when this horrible, deep sense of fear came over me. Every inch of my body felt it. Something wasn't right. Then came the weirdest noise I've ever heard. It sounded like it was coming from maybe 8 to 10 feet above the ground, and the only way I can describe it is it reminded me of someone pulling a long strip off a big roll of thick tape. It was a dragging, tearing sound that lasted a couple seconds each time. It was loud, sharp, repetitive. I tried convincing myself that maybe it was just a deer scraping bark from a tree, but in my gut, I knew that wasn't it. I didn't want to scare Emily, so I stayed quiet and still, hoping whatever it was would just go away. But the sound didn't stop. It actually started getting closer, still high up, still right behind the tent. It was only maybe 6 or 7 feet away now. That's when Emily whispered my name in a panicked voice. I realized then that she was awake and hearing it too. She asked what it was, and I lied, saying it was just a deer and that she should go back to sleep. She answered back that it didn't sound like any deer she'd ever heard, but I just kept pretending everything was okay because I was honestly too frightened to even unzip the tent, let alone run back to the house. We stayed as still as we could, listening to this thing circle the tent. It moved slowly, going from the back to the left side, then around to the right. Kept making that same strange tearing noise every few seconds. It never sped up or slowed down. Then it did something that made my skin crawl. It started moving to the front of the tent, the side that faced the drop-off. That slope went down sharply, and each step forward on that side should have meant the thing's body would have been several feet lower than before. But the sound, it stayed at the exact same height, 8 to 10 feet above the ground, even as it moved along the slope. That didn't make any sense. I even wondered if maybe it was a bird somehow, but it moved way too slowly for that. And no bird I know of makes sounds like heavy hooves stomping on rocks. Eventually, the noise faded off into the woods. The hoof steps and tearing sounds both drifted away together, farther and farther until they were gone. Neither of us spoke after that. We just stayed frozen, too afraid to unzip the tent or move a muscle. We didn't sleep at all. The moment daylight started breaking, we climbed out and rushed straight back down to the house. We told my aunt what happened. She listened but didn't seem too troubled by it. She didn't have any idea what it might have been either. But that night shook me. I've never been camping again, not once since then. I know it wasn't a dream. I wasn't imagining things. Emily heard it too. Over the years, I've asked friends who hunt, hike, and know a lot about animals. None of them has ever heard of anything like that. A few people suggested it could have been a moose, but I looked it up and apparently moose haven't lived in that area since the 1800s. And besides that strange sound, it just didn't act right. If it had been a real creature walking on the ground, the noise it made would have lowered as it moved down that hill in front of the tent. But it didn't. It stayed high up the whole time. That's the part that won't leave me alone. Something was off about that night. Something was really wrong, and I still don't know what it was. It was Labor Day weekend of 2014. My dad, my wife, our 3 young kids, and I decided to stay at a very isolated ranger station we found for rent deep in the forest. It was once used as a fire lookout or something similar. The place had the main cabin and 3 other storage sheds around it. I'll try not to drag this out, but what happened there still baffles me, and I haven't made sense of it all these years later. We arrived, unpacked our stuff, and got settled into the cabin. After that, we all walked a couple hundred feet down toward a nearby stream. None of us had on real shoes, just flip-flops or went barefoot, and we were wearing shorts. Once we got to the rocky shore, we started skipping stones and having fun when I noticed something strange. The ground around us was crawling with snakes, each one roughly a foot long. My wife, my dad, and I each grabbed a kid and ran back up the slope fast. Once we got far enough away to feel safe, I went back alone with a water bottle and caught one of the snakes inside it so I could identify it. Turned out, we had been standing right in the middle of a nest of prairie rattlers. If even one of them had bitten one of my kids, we might not have made it. We were more than 3 hours from any kind of clinic or hospital. Back at the cabin, my dad and I went for a short walk to clear our heads while my wife got the kids settled and made them lunch. When we returned maybe 15 minutes later, the whole cabin was shut up tight, doors and windows locked, even though earlier we had everything open to let air in. As soon as we stepped inside, the kids and my wife were all talking over each other, frantic. They said a big bear had been about 140 yards from the cabin. It had come up near the porch and was huffing and snorting while the kids were out there. The bear had been foraging down by the stream and popped its head up when it noticed them. After a while, things calmed down a bit. Then an ATV passed by the property. It happened 3 times in just a couple hours. On each pass, there were 2 guys riding it, strange looking, like something was just off. They looked rough. They didn't say anything, just stopped at the gate every time and stared, either at the house or straight at us. We hadn't seen a single person the entire trip up to that point. We were deep in the woods of western Montana, probably 2 hours away from the nearest town. Those guys were the only other humans we saw. We decided to get the kids to bed early because night had fallen and the woods got dark fast. Only 10 minutes later, our son, who was 5, suddenly went from being totally fine to burning up with a fever of 103 degrees. He was drooling a bit, almost foaming, and stopped responding completely not long after. It all happened incredibly fast. That was the final straw. We weren't waiting around. I made the call to leave immediately and try to get help. I opened the front door and started loading both our vehicles, using the porch light and the headlights to see. The cars were parked facing the main gate. As we were doing that, all three adults, my dad, my wife, and I, heard multiple large animals moving fast around the cabin. It sounded like 4 or 5 big creatures stomping and running in circles around the property. One of them was pacing on the right side of the cabin, right near the path I was using, and I could hear it breathing hard. I made everyone stay locked inside while I moved bags and gear to the cars. It took maybe 4 or 5 trips. I carried a thick stick in one hand and a big metal pot in the other, slamming the pot loudly each time I went out. I was yelling random words as loud as I could to try and scare off whatever was out there. Once everything was packed, I took the kids out one at a time and buckled them into the vehicles. Then I brought my dad out, followed by my wife. She and I took the lead car and started pulling forward through the open gate. Then, for some dumb reason, I felt like I had to close the gate behind us. I stopped, got out, walked past my dad's car about 15 feet, and shut the gate, which was just a large log that slid between 2 wooden posts. It offered no protection whatsoever. As I turned around to head back to my vehicle, I heard something. Slow, heavy steps, soft but unmistakably large, coming right toward me, only about 8 or 9 feet away. Then I saw a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight. And right after that, the deepest, most terrifying growl I've ever heard came out of the darkness. I didn't look twice. I ran so fast it felt like I flew into the driver's seat and slammed the car into drive. I peeled out, gravel flying. But the weirdness wasn't done. Around 15 minutes down the dirt road, we were still freaking out about our son, who hadn't made a sound or moved. It felt like some kind of darkness was following us. A horrible, crushing feeling that hung over the car like smoke. I happened to glance down and realized I still had the little rattlesnake in that water bottle sitting in my cup holder. I didn't even hesitate. I rolled down the window and flung it out into the trees. Not even 2 minutes later, our son let out a soft cry. We looked back, and he was awake. He mumbled something like, "Why are we going?" and was sobbing because he didn't want to leave. He had no memory of the last hour, including collapsing or getting sick. Here's a little background that adds more weight to what happened next. At the time, my dad was 59. He had been a Lutheran pastor for decades, very practical, not someone who believed in omens or spirits or signs. But the next morning, he broke down. I've never seen him like that before or since. He sat on the porch, sobbing uncontrollably, barely able to get words out. Eventually, he told my wife something he hadn't told anyone. He had a nightmare 2 nights before we left for the trip. In it, we went to a cabin, ran into snakes, saw a bear, and were surrounded by wolves. He said he woke up knowing the place was dangerous and full of something awful. In the dream, he said one of the kids didn't survive. To this day, if I ask him which child it was or how it happened, he shuts down completely. He just starts crying and won't say anything else. He carries a guilt with him like it was his fault for not stopping us. But honestly, it was just a dream. Anyone would have brushed it off. Believe this or not, but about a week later we saw local news reports confirming there was a wolf pack spotted not far from that area. I've heard that wolves and bears don't usually stay near each other, but maybe that's wrong. Or maybe they do keep their distance but cross paths sometimes. The cabin we stayed at was roughly an hour and a half into the forest from a small place called Iron Creek, Montana. You can check for yourself. Wolves, bears, and rattlers are all common in that part of the country. I grew up in wooded areas for most of my childhood and early teen years, and my wife did too until she was about 10. I even have a tattoo sleeve of trees and mountains on my arm. I always felt at home in the woods, but not anymore. Since that night, we haven't stepped foot in the wilderness again. Thanks for listening to all of this. Whether you believe it or not doesn't really matter to me. It happened. My family and I lived through it, and it left a scar that still hasn't fully healed. Maybe one day I'll feel safe out there again, but right now I just can't. When I was 13, I went on a summer camping trip with my local scout group. We didn't go far, only about 10 miles away, to a place we had been to several times before for evening events. Every year, our troop would join 2 other nearby groups for one big camping trip that lasted about 5 days. The place we stayed at had some old stories tied to it. People whispered that the big house on the land was haunted, but the tale went that the spirit only ever showed itself to people related to the family who once owned it. We stayed in a wide open part of the property near the edge of a forest, well away from the main house. I'd been there plenty of times before and was familiar with the area, which was cool. I didn't have my own tent like the older girls, so I shared one with a few of the younger ones, ages ranging from around 9 to 12. The first day and night were normal. We built a kind of jungle gym out of logs, lit small candles after dark, and played a make-believe game where we acted like we had landed on some distant planet. It was just silly fun, but that game ends up maturing later. The next morning, one of the girls and I woke up early because it was our turn to gather firewood for breakfast. We headed into the woods, laughing and picking up sticks as we went. Eventually, we wandered near an obstacle course we weren't really supposed to be using, but we decided to play on it anyway. After messing around for a bit, we picked up more wood and turned back toward camp. That's when things started to feel strange. The woods looked just a little different than how I remembered them. Not in any big way, just slightly off, like the trees were in different spots or the light looked wrong. Trying to be funny, I started trying to creep out the girl I was with, just for laughs. But I must have overdone it because she got freaked out and bolted, leaving me behind. I didn't really care. I took my time heading back. That's when I noticed something move off to the side. And then again, just up ahead. Right as I was about to step out of the woods, I caught sight of someone from the corner of my eye. It was a man, I think. He had on a pale-colored shirt and a hat, and he was carrying something long. Now that I look back, I think it might have been a hunting rifle. But when I looked straight at him, he was gone. I didn't get scared. Stuff like that didn't really bother me. I've seen weirder things. As soon as I stepped out of the forest, everything seemed to snap back to normal. I turned around to look again, and the woods looked just the way they always had. But for a little while, everything back there had seemed newer somehow. The trees didn't seem as wild, and there was this foggy look to everything, like looking through an old window. There wasn't any real fog though, it just had that feeling. I don't really know how to describe it, so I kept quiet and didn't bring it up to anyone. The rest of the trip went on like normal. We played games, sang camp songs, and just had a good time. On the second to last day, we played another version of our Space Planet game. After breakfast, we had to run into the woods and set up shelters, make small fires, and cook simple meals. Some of the girls had to sneak back into camp and steal extra food without being spotted. I was left alone in the forest for a long time while they did that. I made a pretty good shelter and then realized I'd left my pocket knife back in the tent, so I went to get it. When I got to the tent, the younger girls I shared it with were crying, absolutely terrified. Eventually, I got them to explain what had happened. They were trying to make their food when they saw a man appear out of nowhere and then vanish right in front of them. He was wearing a light shirt and a hat, just like the one I'd seen. Same spot too. I tried to calm them down and tell them it was okay, that whatever it was couldn't do anything to them. After a while, they felt brave enough to go back to their game, but I could tell they were really shaken. Later, I got blamed for scaring them with ghost stories. But the only time I had tried to spook anyone was that morning, and I'd never told anyone about the man. That night, we had a campfire. After it ended, we all ran through the dark woods back to camp, leaving the adult who was supervising us behind to put out the fire. She had a flashlight, so we thought it was no big deal. She just had to make sure the flames were out. But I found out later that the walk back scared her badly. She wouldn't say what she saw, only that she'd never camp at that place again. On the last day, we were all packing up, and I was feeling bored and a little curious after everything that had happened. So me and 2 other girls decided to go exploring again. I kind of felt like ghost hunting, I guess. I led the way into the trees. At one point, I stopped walking because I heard footsteps ahead of us. Clear sounds of someone walking on dry leaves, but nobody was there. The other 2 girls stood silently behind me. They heard it too. I followed the sound down a path. It was like someone was walking in big heavy boots, but all of us were wearing soft shoes. The sound led us to a clearing near the edge of the woods. Then it stopped. I sat down in the grass. The others stayed behind me, too scared to sit next to me. I called out into the air, asking for a sign like you see people do on those ghost shows. Right as I finished talking, a white mist rolled in over the trees. You could see shapes moving behind it, but they weren't clear. It just hung there in the air. The 2 girls screamed and ran. I stayed sitting for a bit, just watching. Then I quietly said thank you, and suddenly it felt like wind hit me. But there was no wind. The mist disappeared instantly. It was amazing. That was the last odd thing that happened on that trip. We packed up and headed home later that afternoon. I've been back a few times since then, and everything's been normal. The woods haven't felt strange again. But the story didn't totally end there. A few years later, I started looking into the history of that estate. Remember how I said the ghost supposedly only showed itself to family members? Turns out, I actually have distant relatives from the family that once owned that property. That discovery made everything feel just a little more real. I was 32 that summer, and I needed a break from everything. I had been working construction nonstop for months. My back was sore, my hands were cracked, and I hadn't had more than a weekend off in almost half a year. I didn't have kids, wasn't married, and I didn't really keep in touch with most of my family. I figured if I didn't take time off now, I'd burn out completely. So I took 2 weeks off in late August, right before the weather would start turning cold again in the mountains. I packed up my Tacoma, loaded it with my tent, sleeping bag, cooler, fishing pole, a small shotgun just in case, a hatchet, bear spray, and everything else I thought I'd need. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. Just told a guy I worked with that I was going to Idaho for some camping and fishing, and I'd be back in a couple weeks. That was it. The plan was to go deep, somewhere quiet off any main road, away from the usual campsites. I wanted total peace. I didn't want to hear another voice, not even on a radio. I had found a spot when I was younger, maybe 22 or 23, when I used to do a lot more backcountry hiking. It was about 3 hours north of Boise, then another hour off the paved road, up into the woods past an old fire access trail that had long since grown over. There was a wide creek up there with deep water, full of trout. Cold, clear water. The whole area was thick with lodgepole pine and quaking aspen. If you kept going up the trail another half-mile, you'd hit a grassy clearing where I'd camped years before. That's where I was headed. I got there late afternoon on a Tuesday. It was mid-August, and the sun still stayed high in the sky well into the evening. I parked the truck just off the old trail where it flattened out. The area was so overgrown, I figured no one had been up there in years. I grabbed my pack, hauled out my tent and supplies, and hiked the half-mile up to the clearing by foot. The clearing was just how I remembered it. Flat, soft, and quiet. Big trees on all sides. I couldn't hear anything except for the breeze and the sound of the creek below. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started a small fire using some dry twigs and the firewood I'd brought in the truck. I sat back and just stared at the trees and sky for hours. It felt like the first real breath I'd taken in months. The first few days were peaceful. I got into a simple routine. I'd wake up with the sun, boil some water for coffee, fish the creek until late morning, and then cook what I caught. I'd clean the fish down by the water and bury the guts deep in a hole away from camp. I kept my food in a sealed container and hung it between two trees with rope. I kept the area clean and made sure I never left anything out that could attract animals. At night, the woods got real quiet. I had a fire going most evenings, and I always kept the shotgun close, just in case. I never saw any big predators, but I knew there were black bears and mountain lions in the area. Still, I never felt unsafe. I liked the silence. It made me feel like I was finally out of the world, like nothing could bother me. On the 5th day, things started to feel a little different. It started with something small. I was down by the creek cleaning a couple fish when I heard a stick snap on the other side of the water. Not a little twig. This was a thick crack, like someone had stepped on a dry branch. I stopped moving and looked across the creek, but I didn't see anything. The bank was dense with brush and pine. I stood there a while, just watching, but nothing else moved. Could have been a deer. Could have been nothing. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder more than usual that day. Later that evening, as the sun started to dip below the tree line, I was building a fire when I noticed something else. A few of the small sticks and pieces of kindling I'd left beside the fire ring were gone. I always stacked them in the same place, just outside the tent, under a tree where they'd stay dry. Now there were maybe 5 or 6 missing. At first I thought maybe I just used more than I remembered, or maybe I'd moved them and forgot, but it didn't sit right. I didn't like that feeling. That night I barely slept. I kept hearing noises in the trees, small snaps, rustling, like something moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. I told myself it was squirrels or a raccoon, maybe a porcupine or something digging around. I stayed up a few hours longer than usual and kept the fire high. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was nearby, watching, maybe. The next morning, I woke up to find the rope that held my food had been cut. Not chewed, cut. The ends of the rope were clean, like someone had sliced through them with a knife. The plastic container that held all my food was on the ground, opened. Half the stuff was missing. The rest was scattered on the forest floor. I just stood there for a minute, staring at it. I didn't hear anything during the night. No growls, no sounds of an animal rooting around. And the container hadn't been clawed open. It had been unlatched. Whatever did this had hands. And a knife. I cleaned up the mess, packed what was left of my food back into the container, and moved it closer to my tent. I didn't have enough rope to rehang it properly, so I just kept it close and locked. I carried my shotgun all day, even when I went to the creek. That night, I built a bigger fire. I stayed up late again, watching the trees, listening. Nothing moved. It was dead quiet. Too quiet. Even the wind felt like it had stopped. Just stillness and that terrible feeling in my gut that told me I wasn't alone. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up with a start just after midnight. The fire had burned down low, just glowing embers and a few crackling bits of wood. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened, and that's when I heard it. A slow, steady scraping sound, like metal against wood. It was coming from behind the tent, maybe 10, 15 feet away. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, hand on the shotgun, heart pounding in my chest. The scraping stopped. Then there was a soft thud. Then footsteps. Light, deliberate steps, circling the tent. I could hear the crunch of pine needles, the weight of something moving slowly, quietly. I chambered a shell in the shotgun, loud enough that it would be heard. The footsteps stopped. Then nothing. I sat there for hours, not sleeping, not blinking, just waiting for the sun. When morning finally came, I stepped outside the tent and looked around. There were footprints in the soft dirt, all around my tent. Not boots, not hiking shoes, bare feet, long toes, deep prints, maybe size 11 or 12. They circled the tent twice, then disappeared back into the woods. I was done. I packed everything as fast as I could, threw my gear into the pack, doused the fire, and ran down the trail toward my truck. Every few steps I stopped to listen, thinking I'd hear someone crashing through the brush behind me, but nothing came. I made it to the truck, got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, just catching my breath. Then I turned the key. Nothing. The engine didn't turn over. No click. No sound. I popped the hood and got out, shotgun in hand. I opened it and saw the wires had been cut. Not chewed, clean cut. Battery cable, ignition, fuel line, slashed through like butter. I started panicking. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone, just trees and silence. I grabbed the pack, took the shotgun, and started walking. There was a ranger station about 18 miles back down the road, near the main highway. It would take me most of the day to get there, maybe longer if I had to cut through the brush. But I didn't have a choice. I stayed on the trail for the first few miles, constantly checking behind me. Every little sound made me jump. A bird, a snapping twig. Even my own footsteps had me spinning around with the gun raised. Around noon, I reached a small ridge that gave me a view of the valley below. I stopped there to rest and drink some water. That's when I saw the smoke. A thin column, rising straight into the air, maybe a mile or so behind me, right near where my camp had been. Someone had started a fire. Someone was at my camp. I didn't wait to find out who. I started moving again, faster now, almost running. The rest of that day was a blur. My feet were blistered. My throat was dry. I kept stumbling, cutting through brambles and branches, slipping on rocks. I thought I heard footsteps a few times behind me, but I never saw anyone. I made it to the ranger station just after sunset. It was empty, no vehicles, no one inside, just a locked building and a small radio tower. I broke a window and climbed in, called for help on the radio until someone answered. A team showed up the next morning. Sheriff's deputy, 2 rangers, and a medic. They asked me what happened. I told them everything. They looked at me like I was half crazy, but they took notes. They hiked back with me to the spot where I left the truck. When we got there, the truck was gone. Just tire tracks in the dirt, leading back into the woods. They searched the area, but never found it. Never found the tent or any trace of my camp. It was like I'd never been there. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 31. I had been working long hours at a warehouse job in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and between the stress, the noise, and the concrete, I needed a break from everything. I wanted silence. No machines, no traffic, no people. Just trees, rocks, dirt, and sky. A week before, I'd taken some time off work and started planning a solo camping trip. I didn't want a campground with other people. I didn't want picnic tables or electrical outlets or ranger stations. I wanted something real, something that felt wild. After some searching online, I found an area deep in the Ouachita Mountains, just across the border in Arkansas. It wasn't a national park, so it wasn't as tightly controlled. It was just public land, remote forest trails, no cell service, and nothing around for miles. There were some hiking routes listed online, but most of them were unmarked and not maintained. That sounded perfect. I packed my gear, tent, food, water filter, stove, map, compass, headlamp, knife, bear spray, and a .38 revolver I kept in a hard case. I drove out early on a Thursday morning. It took about 5 hours to get to the base of the mountain area I had picked. The last hour of the drive was nothing but dirt road, winding upward, with thick trees on either side. My car, an old Ford Escape, handled it better than I expected. Eventually, I pulled into a crude little gravel pull-off beside a steep hill. There were no signs, no markers, just a narrow trail that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It matched the satellite image I had printed, so I parked, locked the car, and strapped on my pack. The trail was rough but manageable. Lots of roots and rocks, and the elevation climbed steadily. I didn't see a single person. No footprints, no trash, no wrappers or cigarette butts. It felt untouched, exactly what I wanted. After about 4 hours of hiking, I found a flat area with a small ridge behind it and a creek about 30 yards downhill. It was perfect. I set up my tent under a tall sycamore tree, with my back to the ridge, and cleared a small area for a fire. The air smelled clean, pine, wet earth, moss. I cooked a simple meal, some rice and sausage I brought in a vacuum-sealed pack, and ate sitting on a log. By the time the sun went down, It was already getting chilly. I sat by the fire for a while, just listening to the woods. At first, I heard crickets, owls, the occasional rustle in the trees. Normal things. But around 10 p.m., the woods went quiet. Completely quiet. Not even wind. I remember sitting still, suddenly aware of how alone I was. I felt a twinge of nervousness, but I told myself it was just the wind dying down or the temperature dropping. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and tried to sleep. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no sound, no wind, no animals, but something felt off. I was lying on my back in my sleeping bag, and I could feel my heart beating harder than usual. Then I heard it. Crunch. It was distant, but sharp, like a heavy footstep on dry leaves. I froze. I listened. Crunch. This time closer. Definitely footsteps. One at a time. Slow. Methodical. Coming downhill. I reached for the revolver case I kept beside my bag, quietly unzipped it, and held the gun in both hands under the sleeping bag. I stayed perfectly still. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, barely breathing. Nothing. Just the dark. I stayed like that for maybe an hour. Eventually, I must have drifted off. When I woke up again, the sun was up, and everything felt normal again. Birds were chirping. The creek was bubbling. I convinced myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear. Animals make noises in the woods, especially at night. I spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, following a ridge that gave me a great view of the valley below. I didn't see anyone, and I didn't see any signs of humans. No cut logs, no fires, no trash. I got back to camp around 5 p.m. and made another small meal. I felt more at ease during the daylight. That night, the same thing happened. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Crunch. But this time, it started from the opposite direction, from uphill behind the ridge. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I sat up this time, quietly, and opened the tent flap just an inch. It was too dark to see anything, but I could feel it. That presence. That weight in the air. Something was out there, watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat inside the tent with the gun in my lap, listening. In the morning, I got out and did a slow circle around my camp. About 20 feet away, I found it. A footprint, not a boot print, barefoot. Big, long toes, deep in the mud near the creek. Someone had been there. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. I had no explanation. I packed up my food, loaded my backpack, and decided I'd hike out the next day. One more night. That was it. I didn't want to panic, but I also didn't want to run scared. That afternoon, I stayed closer to camp. I collected firewood, refilled my water from the creek, and tried to keep calm. I told myself it was probably just a homeless guy living off-grid. Maybe he saw my fire and was checking out who I was. That's not comforting, but it's better than imagining something worse. That third night was the longest of my life. I started the fire early and kept it going strong. I didn't want darkness. I wanted light. I set up a ring of small stones around the tent and laid a few sticks around the edges so I could hear if anything stepped over them. At around 11 p.m., the noises started again. But this time, it wasn't just footsteps. There was a sound like a low grunt, short, sharp. Then silence. Then something moved in the brush. Something big. I stood outside the tent now with the fire at my side, the revolver in one hand, flashlight in the other. I shined the light into the woods, but all I saw were trees and shadows. Then I saw movement, just for a second. Something ducking behind a tree, tall, human-shaped. I shouted into the woods. No response, just more movement, slow, deliberate. I fired once into the air. The sound echoed through the trees, sharp and violent. Then silence. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Then I heard it. From the opposite direction, behind me now. Footsteps again. Crunch. Crunch. I turned the flashlight, heart racing. More rustling. Whoever it was, whatever it was, there were two of them. Or it was circling me. I backed toward the fire, scanning the woods, gun shaking in my hand. Then I saw it. A figure, just standing, maybe 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a trunk. I couldn't make out a face, just the shape, too thin, too still. I shouted again. Nothing. Then the figure turned and walked away, silently. I didn't sleep. I sat up all night by the fire, every muscle tight. As soon as the sun started to rise, I packed everything up in under 20 minutes. I left the tent behind. I didn't care. I just wanted out. The hike back felt 3 times longer than the way in. Every sound in the woods made my skin crawl. I didn't stop to eat or drink. I just pushed forward, gun in hand, eyes scanning every direction. I reached the car just after noon. Nothing had been touched. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and drove until I hit paved roads. I didn't stop once. Back in Tulsa, I tried to make sense of it. I checked online forums for that region, looked up missing persons reports, hermits, off-grid communities. Nothing concrete. I never called the police. What could I say? I didn't see a crime, just something wrong. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I know I wasn't alone. And whoever or whatever was out there wasn't just watching. They were playing with me, testing me, waiting for something. I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. My name's Mark, and I'm from Oregon. This happened in late summer of 2016 when I was 34 years old. Back then, I was working as a freelance graphic designer and living alone in a small apartment in Eugene. Most of my work came through emails, and I had long stretches of time where I didn't need to be anywhere specific. That summer, I got tired of looking at screens. I'd been stuck inside for weeks working on a big contract and barely saw sunlight. I needed a break. I wanted to get away from people, noise, traffic, everything. So I decided to go camping, completely alone, somewhere quiet. I didn't want to go to a busy campground with RVs and loud families. I started looking online for more remote places and stumbled across a few mentions of an old quarry-turned forest not far from a small town called Granite, out near the Blue Mountains. There weren't many details about it, and it didn't show up on most camping maps, but a few backpackers mentioned it on a forum. It was on public land and apparently not illegal to camp there, but it wasn't maintained by the state or anything. That sounded perfect to me. The place was about a 5-hour drive from Eugene. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, 2 coolers of food and water, flashlight, folding knife, bear spray, and a backup battery for my phone. I wasn't going to rely on signal out there, so I printed out a physical map. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. That's one of the mistakes I think about a lot now. I left on a Thursday morning, planning to spend 3 nights there. The roads got more remote the closer I got, and the last 2 hours were nothing but dirt roads, thick pines, and occasional animal tracks in the dust. There were no signs. I used landmarks from the forum post, an old rusted gate, a dry creek bed, and a collapsed hunting blind, to finally find the entrance to what looked like an old, overgrown trail. I parked my car under a group of trees, off the side of the road where it wouldn't be easily seen. From there, I hiked about a mile through the trees, carrying my pack and coolers in 2 trips. Eventually, the trees opened into a clearing. The quarry was maybe 300 feet wide, mostly filled in by nature over the years, with small trees and brush growing up through the rock. The cliffs around it weren't huge, maybe 30 feet high, but steep. It felt like I had the whole world to myself. I picked a flat spot near the tree-line and set up my tent. I made a small fire ring with rocks and gathered kindling from the edge of the forest. The air smelled like pine and dry dirt, and there wasn't a single sound besides wind and the occasional bird. No cars, no people, nothing. That first night, I cooked a can of chili over my campfire and laid on my sleeping pad watching the stars come out. It was everything I wanted. I went to sleep early, sometime around 9 p.m. The night was completely silent. I don't think I'd ever heard real silence like that before. It was strange at first, but comforting in a way. I slept hard and woke up with the sun. I felt amazing, more rested than I had in weeks. I spent most of the next day hiking around the area. The quarry had some steep paths along the edge, and I found old bits of machinery scattered around, rusted out and half swallowed by vines. There was even an old pickup truck at the bottom of the quarry. completely stripped and overgrown. It looked like it had been there for decades. I didn't see a single person all day. I didn't even hear a plane. That night, things started to feel different. I had just gotten into my sleeping bag when I heard a noise out in the woods. It was far off but clear. At first, I thought it might be a deer moving through the brush. Twigs snapping, dry leaves rustling. But it kept stopping and starting again, closer each time. Then it would go silent. I didn't have a fire going that night because I wanted to conserve wood, so everything outside my tent was pitch black. I laid there listening for what must have been an hour. Then it stopped completely. I figured whatever it was had moved on, and I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, the flap of my tent was unzipped halfway. That chilled me more than anything else. I always zip it shut when I go to sleep. Not halfway, not sort of, all the way every time. I sat up and looked around. Nothing seemed missing. My coolers were still closed. My pack was still under the flap. I told myself maybe I hadn't zipped it all the way. Maybe I was just tired the night before and left it that way. I didn't want to freak myself out on the second day. Still, something felt off. The forest didn't feel the same. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt empty in a way that made your stomach tense up. I thought maybe I was just getting paranoid, so I tried to ignore it. That afternoon, I hiked down into the quarry again to explore some of the machinery I hadn't looked at closely before. The old truck had deep gouges in the side, like something had scraped metal tools across it. The doors were gone, and the bed was filled with rainwater and moss. I also found an old shovel head stuck in the ground near a small stone structure that looked like a collapsed tool shed. As I climbed back up to my camp, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. There was a small pile of rocks stacked neatly just outside the tree line, maybe 20 feet from my tent. 3 stones, balanced perfectly on top of each other. I hadn't done that. I was sure it hadn't been there before, because I walked that exact path when I brought my coolers in. It was directly in my view from the tent, and I didn't do it. I knocked the rocks over, not out of bravery or anything. I was just freaked out and annoyed and didn't want it there. I spent the rest of the day on edge, glancing into the trees every few minutes, expecting to see someone watching me, but I never saw a thing. That night, I kept the fire going until almost midnight. I used nearly all the wood I'd gathered. I didn't want to be in the dark. When I finally went into my tent, I kept the flashlight on next to me and didn't fall asleep for hours. Every tiny noise had me holding my breath. The wind through the trees sounded like footsteps. I told myself I was being ridiculous. But then, sometime deep in the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Everything was quiet. Then I heard a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves, just outside the tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. It was so faint, I thought maybe it was just a squirrel. But then it happened again, and again. Slow, deliberate steps. I reached for my flashlight and slowly clicked it on. I didn't unzip the tent. I just sat there, heart pounding, listening. The steps circled the tent, then stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, expecting to find footprints or some sign of what had been there. But the ground was hard and dry, and there was nothing visible. Then I saw it again. Another stack of rocks. This one was closer, maybe 10 feet from the fire ring. I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I shoved everything into my bag. Didn't care about organizing it. I loaded up the coolers, collapsed the tent without folding it, and hauled everything back to the car in 2 frantic trips. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. When I got back to my car, it was untouched. I threw everything in the trunk and started the engine. My hands were shaking. That dirt road felt like it went on forever, and I didn't relax until I hit pavement again. I drove all the way back to Eugene without stopping, only pulling over once to pee behind a gas station. I didn't eat until I got home. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about what happened, trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe it was a hermit living out there, or some survivalist who didn't like people trespassing. But the rocks, those weird stacks, felt deliberate in a different way. like they were warnings. I went back to that forum where I first read about the quarry. I tried to find the post again, but it was gone. The user who wrote it had deleted their account. I even messaged a few people who had replied to the thread, but no one responded. I haven't been camping since. Not alone. Not even in a campground. I don't know who or what was out there with me in those woods. Maybe it was just someone messing with me. Maybe it was someone dangerous. But I think if I'd stayed another night, something would have happened. I don't think I would have come home. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night. Sure, I've heard footsteps outside my window. I live in the city now, but even here, when it gets quiet late at night, I can still remember the sound of someone walking around my tent. Slow, careful, watching. My name's Drew Mays. I'm 33 now, but this happened back in 2018, when I was 26. I was living in Oregon at the time, in a small apartment in Eugene, working part-time at a hardware store. I didn't have a lot of friends then. Not because I wasn't friendly, I just liked being alone. I grew up in a quiet household, no siblings, and spent most of my childhood in the woods behind our house. By the time I was old enough to live on my own, being out in nature felt more like home than anything else. That spring had been tough. My hours got cut at work, money was tight, and my landlord kept pushing for rent increases. I didn't want to think about any of it. What I really needed was space. Not from people, just from the noise of everything. So I took some leftover cash, packed up my tent, gear, food, and left town in my old Subaru Forester. I didn't have a particular spot in mind. I just drove east into the Cascade Mountains, off Route 126, until the pavement ended and the gravel took over. I'd done solo trips before, at least a dozen, but this time I wanted to be far from everything. I was looking for those old logging roads most people pass without noticing. The kind that cut through dense forest and fade into brush. It took hours of slow driving, backtracking through thick pine, and scanning old forestry maps on my phone until I found the spot. There was a barely visible dirt path leading off an old fire road, mostly hidden by ferns and fallen branches. No tire tracks, no recent signs of life. I followed it for maybe half a mile before the trees opened into a small clearing surrounded by thick evergreens. I killed the engine, rolled the windows down, and listened. Silence. No birds. No wind. Just the occasional drip of melting snow in the distance. Perfect. I got out, stretched, and walked the perimeter of the clearing. No garbage. No broken glass. No boot prints. Nothing. Felt untouched, like nobody had camped there in years. I set up my tent near the back edge of the clearing, where the tree line dipped slightly downhill. I could still see the car from there, but I was far enough into the woods to feel like I had truly left everything behind. The first day was peaceful. I built a small fire pit, gathered dry wood, and filtered water from a slow-moving stream I'd passed on the way in. I spent the afternoon reading and making instant coffee. I didn't bring any electronics except a small flashlight and my phone, which I kept turned off to save battery. No cell service anyway. I liked it that way. That first night, the forest was quiet. Still no birds, which I found odd. Usually, even deep in the woods, you hear them at dawn and dusk. But here it was dead quiet. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe the altitude or lingering winter had something to do with it. I slept okay that night. Not great. The wind picked up a bit around 2 or 3 a.m., and I kept waking up to small snapping noises in the trees. Not big animals, more like shifting branches or maybe a squirrel. But every time I closed my eyes, I had this feeling I was being watched. I get that sometimes, especially when I'm solo camping, so I told myself it was just my brain playing tricks. By morning, the air felt colder than it should have for late spring. My tent had a light layer of condensation inside. I boiled some water for oatmeal, sat by the fire, and stared into the woods. Still no birds. Just wind through the pine needles and the occasional creak of distant limbs swaying. After breakfast, I hiked around to get a better sense of the area. I marked a few trees near the stream with orange tape in case I lost my bearings. About a mile out, I found what looked like the remains of an old logging road. It was overgrown and mostly collapsed, but I followed it for a bit and noticed faint tire ruts, very old ones. They disappeared into a mess of fallen trees, but it was interesting enough that I snapped a few photos. I spent the afternoon chopping more firewood and reinforcing the backside of my tent with extra branches in case it rained. I kept thinking about those tire ruts though. They were deep, not recent but not ancient either. You could still make out the tread in the dirt like someone had driven up there maybe a few years ago, then never returned. That night, I built a bigger fire. I figured the heat and light would help me sleep better. I kept the fire going for hours, throwing on log after log, just staring into the flames. The sky was clear, stars everywhere. You'd think with that kind of peace, I'd feel relaxed. But I didn't. Something about the place kept me on edge. Not fear exactly, more like my body knew something I didn't. Sometime after midnight, I finally crawled into the tent. I was half asleep when I heard it. A single crack, not a normal branch falling sound, but sharp, clean, like a heavy footstep on dry wood. I froze. The fire had died out hours earlier, so I was in total darkness. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, but I didn't unzip the tent. I just listened. Nothing. Then again crack. This time it was closer. Off to my left, maybe 30 feet. I held my breath and strained to hear more. Still nothing. I told myself it was probably a deer. I'd seen them plenty of times while hiking. Big enough to snap thick branches, but not a threat. Still, I stayed awake for a long time after that, light in hand, barely blinking. Morning came slowly. I crawled out of the tent and checked the area around my camp. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing disturbed, but that didn't make me feel better. It just felt off. I ate quickly and walked down to the stream to refill my water bottle. On the way back, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the clearing, maybe 10 feet from the back of my tent, was a small pile of rocks. 5 of them stacked in a little pyramid. I hadn't made that. I would have remembered. I crouched down and looked closer. They weren't cut or shaped, just ordinary rocks. But the way they were stacked, balanced so neatly, meant someone did it on purpose. Recently, I didn't know what to make of it. I glanced around, heart pounding, but the woods were still. No movement. I kicked the rocks over and stepped back. The rest of the day, I stayed near the fire. I didn't go hiking again. I didn't even leave the clearing. I kept my knife on me and watched the tree line like a hawk. By sunset, the temperature had dropped fast. I could see my breath by the time I got into the tent. I didn't bother with the fire that night. I just wanted to sleep and leave first thing in the morning. At around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a car door slamming. I sat bolt upright in the tent, heart racing. Another slam, then silence. It was unmistakable. Metal on metal. Not far either, maybe 50, 60 yards down the logging road. My car was the only one out there. I grabbed the flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped out barefoot into the cold. I aimed the beam toward the road. Nothing. I listened hard, holding my breath. Still nothing. I moved slowly toward the car, feet crunching over leaves and twigs. The moon was out, casting pale light across the clearing. I could see the back of the forester clearly. Everything looked normal, until I got closer. The rear hatch was open. I stopped dead. I hadn't left it that way. I always locked it. Always. I walked up to the driver's side, hand shaking, and peered inside. The interior light was on. My backpack was open on the back seat. Stuff scattered, my maps, food wrappers, flashlight batteries. Someone had gone through it, but no one was there. I stepped back slowly, listening. The woods were dead quiet. I closed the hatch gently, locked the doors, and backed away. Every part of me wanted to leave right then, but it was pitch black and I wasn't about to drive down that old road in the dark. I went back to the tent, zipped it shut, and sat inside with the flashlight on my lap until the sky turned gray. To first light, I packed everything fast. Tent, stove, food, gear. Tossed it all into the back and slammed the hatch shut. I got in and started the engine. As I backed out of the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach turn. On the tree nearest my tent, Facing inward, where I'd see it from inside, was a fresh mark. A long vertical slash through the bark, like someone had dragged a knife straight down. Not old, not weathered. It was fresh, sap still dripping from the cut. I drove without stopping. Didn't eat, didn't pee, didn't even look back. I didn't relax until I hit pavement 3 hours later and cell service kicked in. I pulled into a gas station, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, heart pounding. I thought about going to the police, but what would I tell them? That someone stacked some rocks and left a scratch on a tree? That I heard noises in the dark? They wouldn't do anything. I deleted the photos I took. I never wanted to see that place again. I never went camping alone after that. Now, years later, I still think about it. That place was miles from anyone. No reason for anyone else to be out there. Whoever it was didn't take anything. They didn't try to hurt me. They just wanted me to know they were there, watching,